So I'd like to start off by um, reminding, I guess, that happiness for the human being, which is definitely not, when I talk about happiness, not talking about pleasure and a sense of uh, excitement or good feeling, but rather the absence of suffering. That happiness in the form of peace of mind, which is the absence of suffering, is available for everyone, for you. That's actually what's more important in this life. Now, whether it actually eventuates or not is a matter of destiny. However, what is meant by happiness, i.e. peace of mind, is available as your birthright, is really saying that the changes that need to happen, if happiness is going to be there, are changes that could, in theory, happen to everyone. That is, that life needs to deliver new conditioning that allows us to create a different rendering of life. And in creating a different rendering of life, we create a different rendering of who we are and what is important. Which really means that the experience that we have of ourself and of life changes. It changes from being an experience that inherent in the experience makes us feel uncomfortable and is our unhappiness in life, to a new experience, essentially, a new rendered experience of life where the sense of self isn't a sense of self pervaded with an uncomfortableness, but rather is a sense of self free of uncomfortableness. Now, often that is referred to as a falling away of the small self and the revealing of our true nature. And the small self is referred to as being a psychological entity that has been created, that has to feel resistance with life, has to feel fear, has to be afraid of dying, simply because of the construct of that psychological identity. And the psychological identity is essentially a whole structure of belief systems that set in place sort of boundaries and ideas and ways of experiencing life that create a particular sense of who I am. And as certain limiting factors fall away, our sense of self opens up. In practical terms, what that looks like is much less of a certain type of thinking. And thinking has a very powerful effect on the experience. We might think of thinking as being fairly two-dimensional, whereas thinking in its intense form can manifest as a sense, as a feeling, even as physical sensations, emotions. We can have two sorts of emotions, the biological emotions and psychological emotions. And psychological emotions are essentially what we would call the different forms of suffering: guilt, blame, pride, worry and anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcome. And when that sort of thinking isn't present, life really reveals itself as being far less personal in nature than it's interpreted to be. We know that because when the interpretation of it as personal falls away, we find life is still here, it's still experienced by an individual, and yet it has the capacity to feel much less personal. And in the less personal experience of life, ironically, there is more fulfillment, more contentment, more meaning. And really, the contentment, the fulfillment, and meaning are best described as the absence of a feeling that there is no meaning, the absence of a feeling of discontentment, the absence of a feeling of unfulfillment. So the absence of the feeling of unfulfillment really means, imagine the feeling of unfulfillment. Okay, it feels heavy and you feel, I am not fulfilled, is the feeling. The absence of the feeling of unfulfillment is the erasing, the removal of that. And it's like, and what we find when that is there, if someone says, do you feel fulfilled? Automatically you could say yes. When you look at it more specifically, you can't find what that fulfillment is. There isn't something that feels like fulfillment. But in the absence of unfulfillment, strangely enough, we have no complaints. And by default, we could say it is a feeling of fulfillment. However, you go to look for it. And there isn't a feeling. If there is a feeling, then that is a layer, part of the experience that would, in my terminology, fit into pleasure or pain. And it could be a pleasure or pain that is linked to something less tangible, more like a awe of life, for example, or an overflowing love. And some of the pleasures and pains, particularly pleasures, we can say have to do with a connection to ourself. And that's lovely, that's worth enjoying when it's there. But let's not mix that up with the very simple absence of the feeling of unfulfillment. So the absence of unfulfillment isn't, we might describe it as a feeling of fulfillment, but when you look for this feeling, you won't find something that you can touch. And if you can find it, then appreciate it, but understand it to be not peace of mind, but peace of mind plus a feeling. And the feeling of non-fulfillment, lack of meaning, tends to be the way we sense life when a certain identity that fires into action from time to time is present and is firing into action regularly. If it fires into action regularly, then what it turns into is arguments, it turns into resentment, it turns into shame, it turns into envy and jealousy. And so if that's what's happening, and comparing yourselves and hearing comments that the others make and taking it personally and then blaming the other and hating the other. So if that's the identity that is in place and those responses to circumstance are happening often enough, then those responses or reactions are uncomfortable in and of themselves. And even when they're not happening, there tends to be an underlying sense of unfulfillment or non-fulfillment. And if those feelings don't arise regularly, which means the identity of taking life personally and seeing oneself as the doer and attached to outcomes, if that has dissolved, then by default, in between interactions with others and just while going about your ordinary business, the sense is a sense of being at one and at peace with life. And the question of meaning, I'm looking for meaning in life, is usually a result of a feeling of meaninglessness being present. And meaninglessness is essentially a byproduct of this psychological identity, which is essentially the default structure that life puts in place. And when that's present, it just doesn't seem like things have much purpose, or that we are seeking outcomes and we get those sometimes, and it really doesn't satisfy. And so an ingrained sense of meaninglessness kicks in. And so that's when, if we're feeling like we're seeking for meaning, it isn't so much because we haven't found meaning, it's more because there is a presence of the feeling of meaninglessness. And this isn't appreciated. So what happens is we become convinced that I have to search for meaning in life, instead of realizing, I feel like I need to. It feels like I need to search for meaning, simply because there is a feeling of meaninglessness. And instead of that being solved by finding meaning, what we hopefully will start to see is that when the feeling of meaninglessness falls away, the need for meaning falls away. And in the absence of the need for meaning, we can then say, actually life feels meaningful. And meaningful is very much like content and fulfillment. You try and put your finger on why is life meaningful, and it's a causeless meaning, and actually it is the absence of meaninglessness. This is, the peace that passeth understanding. Is talking about a peace that doesn't make sense in a way. It doesn't make sense to the attachment to outcome. So attachment to outcome is our logic that has been set in place that says, my happiness is to be found in outcomes. My happiness is to be found in the presence of a good feeling. And so when we find this peace, and we can't put our finger on it, we can't find a cause for it, it's a causeless peace. It doesn't make sense according to our understanding of life as being causal, and in particular, my happiness will be caused by outcomes in the future. So this recognition that unhappiness, lack of meaning, lack of contentment, lack of fulfillment, boredom, feeling unlovable, are not what they seem. They seem like they are the lack of something. And for as long as we interpret them as the lack of something, we'll go out seeking that something, thinking that that is the answer. So if our attention can land on the fact that, the feeling that says I need that is simply because of the presence of something else, the presence of a feeling of lack of worthiness, a presence of a feeling of meaninglessness. And so we need to turn our focus onto what is the cause of that sense, that feeling. And if we do that, we essentially turn inwards. We start looking at the inner dynamics rather than focusing outwards, thinking that the other is the cause of our problem, or the lack of opportunity that we have in life is the cause of the feeling of meaninglessness, and or the lack of activities is what makes me feel bored, or the lack of a hobby or a mission or a project. That's where we assume the problem lies, and we are outward seeking. So the statement, your happiness isn't to be found in outcomes, is really reminding us of an ingrained error, which is part of the ingrained misunderstanding of who we are, which really means a misunderstanding of what we need to be complete and where it's to be found. And so the ingrained psychological self that has been put in place believes itself to be incomplete because it feels that way, believes itself to be in control of life because it feels that way, and believes its happiness to be found in the future, in outcomes, in circumstance, in pleasure or pain, because that's the best it's known, and it follows on from the sense of self it has, that completeness will be found in the future. So it's very helpful to understand here that our uncomfortableness is always an attitude to life. And what is the attitude that leads to suffering? It's the attitude that sees oneself as the doer, sees the other as the doer, and sees one's happiness to be found in outcomes. That's the attitude. That means an attitude born from a deeply ingrained sense of self. I am the doer, my happiness is to be found in outcomes. So it's very useful to hear that your happiness isn't to be found in outcomes. That might mean that when we see the thinking of the thinking mind going off into this narrative based on this this character at the center of the narrative, you shouldn't have done this to me because that means this about me, and it means this about you, and because that is pain that you delivered because of your actions, that means that you are taking my completeness and my happiness away from me, and you should act differently. And now I hate you. All of that is contained in the narrative. And so if we start to understand that narrative is based on the presupposition of a me and an other that are in control of how one acts in life and how life turns out, and a belief that my completeness is to be found when one day life cooperates and delivers idealism. So it's that concept is like calibration for an instrument. It tells the instrument what to be alert to. And before the instrument, and I'm talking about the working mind, before the working mind is delivered this new conditioning, it isn't really calibrated to know what to keep an eye out for. And what is calibrated incorrectly is the thinking mind that is keeping an eye out for life being perfect and trying to control life such that it's perfect. So once the working mind gets calibrated with the information that there is a false sense of self that has been ingrained by life, so it isn't your fault. Life has put it in place, and let's just see it. Let's be aware of it when it's happening. It's not even telling you to change it. Funnily enough, just the recognition of dynamics changes them without there needing to be a changer. This is what the principle of non-doership is really all about. It says life happens even when there is no one doing life. So life delivers new conditioning through an organism that is programmed and designed by life to deliver that new conditioning. The new conditioning is received by a body-mind organism that is designed to receive new information, process it. No doer required for all of that. The ears can't help but hear sounds. The brain can't help but process those sounds according to its understanding of language. And that becomes part of the updated design of the person. And awareness of the suffering narrative when it happens can't help but happen, because the instrument has now, as part of that impersonal process, has been designed to, just in the same way as it knows a dog as a dog, and it knows a growling dog as something to stay away from, it now knows the narrative based on what I need in order to be complete, the narrative based on you hurt me and you should have done it differently, to be an expression of the false sense of self and to be the reason for uncomfortableness in life. So that happens automatically. And when that awareness happens automatically, something else happens automatically, and that is the system starts to change. So there never has been a doer doing life. There has always been an expression of life, living life. The human being, all human beings, are a particular modulation of source or consciousness or energy or God, whichever word you want to use. We don't really need to know what the source is. We get to see the expression of it. And if we can come to see and understand the expression, i.e. what life, our experience of life, as the expression of source, then it's much less personal. And that includes the expression of the individual in whichever way it expresses itself. So even the suffering, even the misunderstanding of who we are is an expression of life, not someone's doing. And thinking is one of the expressions, the impersonal expression of life. Now, it might sound confusing. What do you mean impersonal expression? Because thinking often is very personal in content. You know, you did this to me and it was disrespectful. It's sort of like if someone spits in your face and the thought is, how dare you spit in my face? That thought is very personal. If we can see that very personal thought is actually an impersonal output, And what I mean by an impersonal output is it is created by a person, but the person is, in a sense, mechanical. And so there's no potential for that thought to be different. And so what we tend to know as a person and refer to as a person and personal is this idea that I am autonomous, that a person is autonomous and in control. And so when we see that it isn't the output of someone that is in control, then we can say it's impersonal. Even if the content of that impersonal movement is very personal in content, it's still fundamentally an impersonal movement. And to the extent that we start to relate to the suffering, which in content is very personal, as an impersonal arising. So this is why in some meditation techniques, you might be asked to look at thoughts as clouds moving across the sky, because a cloud has a connotation of being impersonal, just an object moving across the sky. And so if we can start to see thoughts as objects, even if the content of the object is very personal, we can see it as a piece of writing, let's say on a piece of paper going across. And what is aware of the cloud, what is aware of the personal content, is witnessing it, and therefore is not identified with that content as if it is it. From this perspective, we can even laugh at our outputs. You can laugh at yourself. That's one of the things about not taking yourself too seriously, is to be able to laugh at your own stupidity when we say something that doesn't make so much sense, or if we do something that clearly in hindsight we say it's not the best way to have dealt with it. And we can laugh at the fact that we can do something so suboptimally and realize it's impersonal. So laughing at our shortcomings is, and I don't mean laughing at it in a way where we pretend to not take it personally. It's this is why at certain awakening moments there is this combination of crying and laughter, sometimes simultaneously. We don't know if we're meant to be crying or laughing or both at once, and sometimes the crying first and then the laughing. At the crying, which can be so intense, there's immense emotion can come out in those moments of awakening where a lot of structures tend to fall apart, and it can coincide with a sense of surrender, and the surrender can sometimes happen because the circumstance is just so painful and it creates so much suffering, and there can be a surrender to the fact that it's all too hard and I can't do this, I've been trying, and yet there I go, just about to think I'm in control. I get to the other end and life slams you back, and sort of drowns you with suffering, and you realize that you only almost grabbed on because the wave swept you up, and just as you're going to drag on, another wave comes and smashes you back out. And at that point you realize, oh, it's just out of my control whether I get pushed up such that I can grab on. And so there's a stopping of the psychological me that thinks it is making itself get closer to grabbing on. And in that, the pent-up suffering from the past, where life feels so unfair and so personal, that can come out and we can be overwhelmed by that feeling. And if we're lucky in that surrender, the identity collapses. And when the identity collapses, there's a laughter at the tragedy, let's say, of life, where it's seen that we couldn't help but have taken it to be personal. It wasn't personal. We didn't do that. That was how it felt. And we didn't create the complex interpretation of life. And so it forced us to take life so personally and to struggle. And in that moment, all of that started coming out. And as part of that coming out, the identity collapses and there's a shift and a recognition that there really is no one suffering. What there is a certain energetic flow of emotion that within it includes the idea of the one that is suffering. And in the moment when that release brings about a dissolution of what previously had remained being a fairly constant sense of self, then it's seen more clearly. Oh, there is no one as believed. And life is seen to be very funny. It's sometimes referred to as the tragic joke. So as part of that process, withdrawing from life, it's not really withdrawing from life. You can't ever withdraw from life. You're always going to be within life. But withdrawing from certain activities is a movement that can make sense. When we see that the sense of self is being continually reinforced by our response to the circumstance we're in. And if we see that a particular circumstance, a particular engaging with certain activities, certain people, triggers a response that is clearly one's relationship to life from the perspective of this psychological self, then if the thought arises, well, what if I limit my exposure to those circumstances? What if I change the way that I respond to comments from people, which the very recognition or the very thinking about that may be part of the impersonal process that allows a change to happen. Now, that when you say, what if I change that I is not really a doer that is in control, but having the thought that recognizes that a certain interaction, a certain way of engaging is reinforcing the sense of self, then the thought is, well, let's see if change can happen. and the outcome is not in your control. But the fact that the thought arises in the first place is a good sign. And so until that thought happened, we'd say yes to certain invitations, habitually, continuously, like we always have, because the system, until certain things are seen, assumes that those are good for it, that they're going to deliver something positive. When we start seeing actually what it delivers is reinforcement of an identity, because those interactions drag out a certain response. And so we might then find ourselves naturally, because we understand why, saying no to certain invitations. We might find ourselves cutting ourselves off when we respond in an argumentative way. We might find ourselves coming up with excuses to excuse ourselves from certain conversations. And you might be able to start comparing what is going on if you keep yourself in a conversation, and when you walk away, after 30 seconds of walking away and being in a neutral space, you might realize, oh, look, the content is different because the engagement is different. So even though happiness isn't to be found in circumstance, if our attitude to circumstance is a certain way and it keeps forcing us into particular circumstance, then it's not so much the circumstance that's causing the problem, but it's our attitude that is going into the circumstance. Now, changing the circumstance can be part of a feedback loop to changing the attitude. Once the attitude of doership and attachment has dissolved, we can then find that whatever the circumstance we find ourselves in, there is peace of mind, and yet we will still move towards circumstance that we prefer if it's available. And that is based on the biological preference of the body. And so just like we might pull ourselves out of a certain conversation because it's not pleasurable, even after suffering has stopped being part of that interaction, we might still say to ourselves, actually, let me leave because that's not an enjoyable exchange. In the same way as that function happens, it can happen and be part of the dissolving of the belief of doership and attachment to outcome, by seeing the benefit of withdrawing. So if we're in a relationship that has been put in place by attachment to outcome, or in a job, so we've set up our world at a previous time when our attitude was based on attachment to outcome, we could use the concept that says my happiness isn't dependent on circumstance, and think that I don't need to, the circumstance isn't the problem, but my attitude to the circumstance is the problem. And it's true, if it was possible for one's attitude to change, then you find yourself in the same circumstance, in the same job, in the same relationship, and your attitude has changed, so there's no suffering. However, if the circumstance was put in place by a particular attitude, then very often, until we find the motivation to change the circumstance, what the circumstance is doing is feeding back into the very attitude that put the circumstance in place, put the relationship in place, let's say, based on an attitude of fear. And so for as long as, if a relationship is put in place because of an attitude of fear, rather than love, let's say, then for as long as that relationship doesn't change, it must mean that we're in it because of fear. And so if that's the case, it is a feedback loop that is reinforcing the very identity that existed at the time it put the situation in place. Now, these changes are not something that can happen ahead of time. They're just too scary, in a sense, to the identity that put them in place in the first place, because it felt like that was delivering something to it, or going to deliver something to it. That changing that is too scary because of what that identity believes it's going to lose by changing the relationship. And on the flip side, when the psychological identity has changed sufficiently because of other factors other than changing the circumstance, then the identity starts to feel so uncomfortable in that circumstance, or not really the identity, the person that is changing starts to feel so uncomfortable in that circumstance that eventually it can't help but make a change. And that's all destiny unfolding, because its makeup, when it put the circumstance, when it put the relationship in place, its attitude wasn't its doing, and the changes to the person that eventually make the relationship unpalatable, also not its doing. And so the changes, or the staying in the relationship, not someone's doing, but all are happening according to life. So we'll open it up to some questions. Hi, Holger.
Hello, Roger. There's so much beauty and openness in what you share. I mean, it's just amazing. It's like party time.
It's like?
Party time?
Oh yeah, okay. I'm often told I'm not the life of the party.
But a party in a monastery, I mean, it's very subtle.
Yes, I know what you mean.
What is the difference between, I like when you said it's about recalibrating. It's a recalibration.
Mm-hmm.
This I am, what is the difference between the I am just as a thought and as a presence?
They're chalk and cheese, really. They're two different things. To think I am can happen when you're not particularly consciously aware of the impersonal I am, the impersonal I amness. That, I guess, is the standard personal pronoun that everyone knows themselves as, the I am thought. And I amness, I guess, is when we realize that there is a difference between the narrative I am and the primordial sense of I am that is before any thinking. Before, during, and after, actually. And so the appreciation of I am, the coming in contact with I am, really needs some guidance, I guess. And the guidance is, well, what are you if you are neither this nor that? And you can pick two opposites. I am worthless or I am worthy. What are you if you are neither worthless or worthy?
There seems to be like a fear or something, like an unfamiliarity that I, in my past, always just rejected, and then I pulled back into my person, basically, and it's I don't know how to describe it, but it's something beautiful. It fits so nicely with the recalibration. Because I habitually always ran away from it. I mean, it's kind of crazy because the thing that maybe could set me free, I rejected.
Yeah, I guess that's what we do when we think that meaning is, in doing, we have to go and get it. So I guess sitting still doesn't make any sense. In fact, it seems like we're preventing our happiness from happening by sitting still. And so once we get back on track, i.e. that error gets corrected, every time we go shooting outward, something pops up and says, hey, just no need to do that. Just be here.
What about investment and identity? I cannot avoid it. I mean, it always pops up, but I don't need to engage myself with it. I mean, I cannot avoid it in a way. This is how it feels to me. I'm always kind of, attached to my point of view, to this body-mind perspective.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's two sorts of attachment, or let's not use the word attachment. There is the word identification is often used to denote our being lost with an object. So identification with an object, identification with thoughts, identification with emotions, where we have no sense of perspective. And so therefore we are completely identified, completely invested in that movement. So essentially we have lost ourself and know ourself only as that movement. That's how the word identification is usually used. And so if we are asked to witness the thoughts, witness the emotions, witness the movement of the body, if that witnessing happens, and the more we are told to witness something, essentially the something that we are being asked to witness is described as an object that is previously not seen as an object. In the identification, it is felt as what I am. And the more that we are told here that witness the thought as an object arising in consciousness, witness the body moving, witness all of life, which includes the thoughts and the body moving as a happening, not your doing, all of those descriptions tend to create a separation of subject and object. So the objects that were previously identified with, which really means the subject gets lost in that object, get pried apart, and the subject, which in this case is the witnessing, starts to see the objects that it was previously identified with as not what it is. So that movement is the movement that can happen, and what we can call a breaking of identification with objects, which can reveal our subjectivity. Now, what you spoke of, which is always knowing life from a particular perspective is not necessarily the same as identification with objects. Now, when that identification that I was just talking about breaks and there is a witnessing, it feels like life is being witnessed from outside of the body. Really what's happening is it's being witnessed from outside of that identification, that investment, that merged position. And for a while, it feels like, and we think that we are aware of objects from a non-subjective, or from an absolute point of view. And we might even form the conclusion that we're aware of those objects not from the body perspective. It can feel like there is awareness of these objects from outside of the body. What we can start to see is, after that separation has happened, is an integration, which is a sort of refining of that separation, that witnessing, such that we realize, when I'm witnessing a thought, or if I'm witnessing an object like the lamp or the tree, even if it feels like I'm witnessing it from outside of the body, if you put your hands over, if the hands go up over the eyes, we realize that the witnessing of the tree changes. And if we were witnessing from outside of the body, when hands come up over the eyes, the image of the tree shouldn't change, because if in theory we're not witnessing the tree from the perspective of the body, then hands over the eyes shouldn't change the image of the tree. In practice, the hands over the eyes do change the image of the tree, of what is being witnessed, even when it feels like it's being witnessed from outside of the body. Now, this has to get us to refine what's going on, which really means refine our concept, our understanding of what's going on. And that's where a different use of the word identification can come in. So in the teaching, we say the human being is impersonal consciousness identified with a particular body-mind organism, functioning through that body-mind organism as personal consciousness. Now, in that context, and I've often changed the wording from impersonal consciousness of source identified with a particular body-mind organism to impersonal consciousness of source linked to a particular body-mind organism, to avoid this confusion. The human being is always, even enlightened human being, is always impersonal consciousness of source linked to a particular body-mind organism functioning through it. That is evident by the fact that if Ramana put his hand over his eyes, I live life as if he would have his vision of the tree obstructed, as just like you or I would when hands go in front of the eyes. And so that's what's meant, that even after liberation, the human being is always consciousness linked to a particular body-mind organism and functioning through it. Even when it feels like consciousness is enveloping the body-mind organism, that even when it feels like the body-mind organism is arising inside of consciousness, we can do some experiments or some tests to show how simultaneously consciousness is functioning through the body-mind organism. Just so if you block the ears, the sound components of of daily life for the liberated, non-identified master block the ears, and the sounds of the traffic go away. So then we can say, okay, so the master is non-identified, the identification with the body, identification with the thoughts, identification with the emotions has fallen away. What does that really mean? The assumption is that they no longer know themselves as the body and the thoughts and the mind. And that's not entirely true. What has happened is they don't know themselves exclusively as the movement of body, thoughts, and emotions. There is this separation that has happened. That means there can be a witnessing of the movement of the body, of the thoughts, of the emotions. And yet, consciousness is still linked to the body-mind organism, or we can use the word identified, but understanding identified is used in a different way when we say, and functioning through that body-mind organism as personal consciousness. Even if the master feels like everything is very impersonal, it is still personal consciousness, because it's still consciousness functioning through a particular body with name and form. And so after liberation, Ramana, if he was called Bhagwan, God, Ramana, someone called his name, he would turn around and say, yes, how can I help you? Which demonstrates that there is still an identification with name and form. Otherwise, if the identification with name and form was completely annihilated, when someone called his name, it would be the same as if someone else's name was called. And that simply isn't how life continues to function. So I'm not exactly sure if that was your question, but anyway, it inspired a description of a fairly important distinction.
And I had some interesting shaking in my body just listening to you. Some release or something really good. I have not more on my mind. I just created. I created a website. I have this thing with websites. I cannot help it. It's called beingtogether.live. Mm-hmm. And this was inspired through last week, just to be in your Zoom room and just to share with some other people.
I see.
And it felt so good. I mean, and yeah, I just wanted to share this. And
well, if you put,
I really appreciate.
If you put the website address in the comments on Facebook or here, then anyone listening who's interested to have a look can do so.
Thank you so much. Yes,
on Facebook in particular.
Okay, good. Because I feel so, I don't like really Facebook and all those other forums, because to me it's so loud. There's so much chit-chat and so much confusion.
No, but I mean, if you put the website address on there, if you want people to I don't know, I'm guessing on the website there's some sort of community that you can form, right? Or
yeah, that's the idea. Just right now, it's just a proof of concept. It's just a thinking out loud, and because by myself I wouldn't do anything. I mean, it's good to have some other people. It's very stimulating in a good way.
Yes. Well, I'm sure others feel the same way.
Okay. Thank you so much, Roger. Beautiful.
Thank you, Holger. Hi, Luca.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
So today I had this insight that said that I was looking back at my life in these past few weeks, and I realized that the suffering's been a lot less. Mm-hmm. And I realized that I had this last blockage in the body-mind organism, and this blockage is pretty much seeking happiness in outcome, in any pleasure.
Right.
And there's a lot of fantasizing here. And it's just automatic, because it's just so ingrained. Because I've been doing it since I was a little boy, pretty much. And so I'm just observing that, and I realize that it's futile, that life is just an alternation of pleasure and pain. But the mechanism is loosening. But I hope you could just like say something to.
Yeah, well, what's interesting in these cases is to see if this habit of going back to a pleasure is somehow dampening the suffering feeling or cutting it off. But it's important to notice temporarily, and to see why that has been set in place as a solution. And I suggest it's been set in place as a solution because it does create a temporary relief. And then the question is, if it creates a temporary relief to the uncomfortableness, then maybe what it's doing is it's removing or cancelling a primary variable that is part of the suffering dynamic. And then it's also very important to notice that it only creates a temporary relief, and in fact, not only is it temporary and not permanent, and so I'm not saying it's not good because it's only temporary, because if it was temporary but it had no detrimental effect, then I guess temporary relief is better than no relief. However, if it's temporary relief and it has a detrimental effect, then becoming aware of that might be useful at that habit stopping. So I'll just clarify all of that again in slightly different words. Or let me first ask you, is that what you're talking about? That if you feel an uncomfortableness, you'll go off into an enjoyment of a pleasure, which, let's say in this case, is some sort of daydream or fantasy, and that effectively cuts off the suffering for a while. Sorry, say that again?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so then my suggestion is to investigate why it is that it cuts off the suffering. And one of the reasons that it could cut off the suffering is that the receiving of the pleasure when you engage in the habit, and it's usually a habit that delivers some sort of pleasure, the receiving of the pleasure undermines an assumption of the suffering or in the suffering. So what that could be is that in the underlying suffering, there could be a sense of I am not worthy of X, Y, and Z, or I am not good enough, and it might be very unconscious. Now that then is felt as an uncomfortableness, so we might not know what the narrative is, but there's a feeling of uncomfortableness, and we automatically go for a pleasure. Now when we receive pleasure in the moment might be received by the brain as you got a reward. Life has given you a reward, pleasure. Therefore, you must be good enough, because if you're not good enough, you wouldn't get a reward from life. And so in receiving the pleasure, you undermine the narrative that says, I'm not good enough, temporarily while the pleasure is present. When the pleasure ceases, the narrative that says, oh, I knew I wasn't good enough, because now there's no pleasure, so that kicks back in. It doesn't even necessarily say because there's no pleasure, it just says, I'm not good enough. That's the feeling. And then that feeling is uncomfortable again, which inspires us to go for pleasure. And then we get the pleasure and we go, oh, I've now confirmed I must be good enough because life is giving me pleasure. Now, what that's doing is reinforcing that my good enough or my sense of self is in line with a psychological sense of self. So each time we go out seeking for pleasure, we're really acknowledging the fact that maybe I'm not good enough, because if I don't get the pleasure from life, then that will be double proof that I'm not good enough. So that habit is actually validating the potential that you are not good enough, but you just want to find out that you are good enough. And real peace of mind is the dissolving of the ingrained sense that I am not good enough, because of it coming into connection with the self that is causeless, the self that is already complete, and therefore the notion of I'm good enough or I'm not good enough just simply doesn't make sense. When we lose touch with that sense of self that is already complete, and we exchange it for a sense of self that often, a sense of self which is not what we really are, then we're forced into feeling what that false sense of self has inherently within it, which is uncomfortableness, because the only comfortable self is the true self. So really what I'm pointing out is this movement towards pleasure, without us necessarily realizing it, is reinforcing the false sense of self and keeping us disconnected from the real sense of self. Once we realize this, we might find ourselves less inclined to go for the pleasure as often as we were when we didn't realize this. Now, that doesn't mean that this is an instruction to not go for the pleasure. Frankly, keep going for the pleasure as long as there's an awareness of the dynamic I'm talking about. That's enough, just to be aware of the movement towards the pleasure and why it's happening, to be aware of what it actually delivers outside of just the pleasure in the moment. So see a bigger picture, which might include certain consequences that are part of indulging in those pleasures. And then change can happen automatically because certain dynamics that weren't seen start to become seen.
That was all right. Yeah, that was all correct. There has been a lessening towards pleasure. Like it's less intense. Like I have like less desire to continuously distract myself all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, you were talking about a narrative before of like not feeling good enough. That was really like close. I'd phrase it more like not worthy of being loved.
Mm-hmm.
That's the feeling there, and that's why the pleasure keeps on. The desire keeps on like rolling around. Yeah, that was really useful.
Yeah. Well, see if any of the nuances sort of flesh themselves out as you pay more and more attention to it. Okay, I think we've got one more question, maybe more than that. Hi, Peter. Okay.
Hi, do you hear me?
Yes, I've got you now. Yep.
Okay. Hi, Roger.
Hello.
Yeah, so what is my question exactly? I guess I've been trying to, one thing I've been thinking about lately is sort of the relationship between non-doership and attachment to outcomes. Mm-hmm. It almost feels, at least in the discussions, that there's I guess there's not a separation. I guess I was wondering, is it possible to sort of have a ingrained sense of non-doership, but also remain attached to outcomes, or are those two mutually exclusive? And I guess it comes about, I sort of feel, that I've been sort of assimilating this idea of non-doership, and it expresses itself in practical ways, in the sense that I do feel a general, a more peace of mind in general, in a general day-to-day sense. But I guess there are sort of residues or something, I don't know, and it comes up, obviously. I mean, I know that I'm not completely free of the idea of non-doership. And it's sort of related to the previous caller. I guess I engage in sort of fantasies, and they're tinged with sort of hope, maybe, or hope of us. I guess that goes, and that there's, I guess that's where I'm recognizing this sense of attachment to outcome, but they're very subtle, maybe. So I guess, sorry, I'm not sure maybe I'm answering my own question in a sense, but what is that connection between non-doer? Is it possible, I guess, sorry, just to simplify the question, is it possible to have a sense of non-doership yet remain attached to outcomes?
I would say not if the understanding of non-doership is total, which means if there's a complete, deep, total realization that there simply cannot be a doer, that dissolves the whole identity, and the identity includes attachment to outcomes. So if the understanding of non-doership is total, then the dissolving of attachment to outcome is also total. How I would describe it is that the identity is really made up of, it's a single identity made up of two components, but the components are interconnected. And those two components are doership and attachment to outcome, and it's the one identity. And in that identity being dissolved, we could say that it gets dissolved by us seeing and by life showing the different parts of it, and sometimes that's shining a light on the belief in personal doership, which is primarily where the blame and the guilt and the pride are based. However, when we look at blame, it's like, why are we blaming the other? We're blaming the other because they've delivered pain, and the pain is an issue because of the simultaneous existence of attachment to outcome. So that's where we get to see that they're not that separate. But in some cases, it's worth looking at the doership point of view. In other cases, it's worth looking at the attachment to outcome point of view. And in each of those, there will be the other half. So they're two sides of a coin of suffering, really. And it's just useful to see it through the different lens, sometimes doership and sometimes attachment to outcome. Mainly, guilt, blame, and pride, you would look through the lens of see that it contains the belief of doership. Worry, anxiety, and attachment to outcomes and expectation has more to do with attachment to outcome. However, in expectation, there is the doer trying to get the outcome. And usually the total understanding is because both of them are being whittled down together until there's not enough substance in the left in the identity, and the rest of it collapses. And that can be gradual, and even the collapse, when I say the rest of it collapse, doesn't mean that that's going to be particularly noticeable. It's just noticeable in the absence of suffering, and you might look back and realize, oh, for the last 3 weeks or 3 months, suffering just hasn't arisen, and so then you can go, so that the understanding must have happened. So it can be very gradual, so much so that the suffering tapers off gradually, and then it stops altogether, and you don't even realize it's stopped altogether until you look back and see a period where you just simply haven't been worrying or blaming, etc., etc. Now, Ramesh used to focus primarily on the doership, and so he would talk about attachment to outcome as a subset of doership, which is completely valid when we look at it. That if there was no blame or no belief in doership, then you wouldn't have anxiety and worry, because you'd know that life was just going to happen, and so what's the point of worrying and being anxious? And if there's completely no doership, you'd have no expectation, because you'd know that life is just going to turn out one way, so where's the point of having expectation? And on the flip side, in some of the Buddha's summaries of the Buddha's realization, since suffering or enlightenment is the end of suffering, the cause of suffering is desire. The cause of desire is attachment. So what does all of that mean? In brief, it means that for Buddha, attachment was the key. And so he said that enlightenment is the end of suffering. The cause of suffering is attachment. The cause of suffering is desire, and the cause of desire is attachment. So why is the cause of desire attachment? Attachment means I believe that what I need in order to be complete, meaning this is my sense of self, I am someone or something that is incomplete at the moment, which is why I don't feel great in life. And when I will be complete is when I get X, Y, and Z. So let's look at love. Love is the deepest attachment to outcome that we have. So it believes that when I get love, I will be complete. So that is what attachment is, the belief that I will be complete because of outcomes. That then forces us to crave that outcome. It's almost like a matter of life and death. So that attachment to outcome turns into a craving for outcome, which is what desire is. Desire in Buddhism, desire refers to the craving towards outcomes, or the craving towards the love. And that craving is suffering. And suffering is what disturbs liberation. So from Buddha's point of view, he would look at the root as being attachment. Ramesh looked at the root as being doership. And the truth is that they're not really that different, or they're different sides of the identity coin, let's say.
Right. Is one sort of a deeper level? It almost seems to me like attachment to outcomes is almost a second level, or for lack of a better word, a deeper level than the non-doership. Maybe not. Again, I guess that contradicts what you say. I guess they're both one and the same, or same sides of the same coin. If you can come to understand a sense of, or have an ingrained sense of non-doership, does that, by definition, lead to a falling away of desires, for example? I don't know.
Yeah.
I guess you kind of answered that, but
yeah,
I guess
I would say that attachment probably is deeper. However, there's a sort of trapdoor protecting us from getting to attachment to outcome, or at least in total, and that trapdoor is the doership. So if we don't realize the doership, because essentially you could say the doership is an expression of our of our attachment to outcomes. If we weren't attached to outcome, we wouldn't blame the other for not delivering pleasure. So if you took away attachment to outcome, it's sort of like having, a really old bike that's actually a piece of junk in your front garden, and you want to take it to the rubbish tip, but you haven't taken it to the rubbish tip, and it's really annoying you, and you keep meaning to do it, but you can't be bothered going to the rubbish tip, and then one day someone's stolen the bike. You don't blame them, do you? Because you by default are not attached to that item. So you have no reason to blame them for stealing it. If, on the other hand, it's your favorite bike that you just bought, spent lots of money, saved up for 3 years, bought it, and then it gets stolen, then you hate the person because you have an affinity with the bike, let's say. So I guess deeper down it's attachment to outcome, but if the doership is a result of attachment to outcome, sometimes you have to knock down that wall before you're going to get to the attachment to outcome in totality. So the truth is, I feel like putting them both up there as the two sides of the suffering coin, meaning the two sides of the psychological identity. I don't see how it can hurt. On some days you're going to see the attachment to outcome, and on other days you're going to see the doership, depending on how the suffering is constructed and how it's presenting itself.
Because it seems to me like, at least in my current understanding, like I can sort of have a sense of non-doership and not blame or not feel shame or responsibility. I don't know. I notice you don't use that word responsibility, which I've always, because I somehow interpret the word non-doership as non-responsibility, but that's a separate. Anyway, thank you very much. That's good. That's helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. We'll move on to the next questioner, but your point about responsibility is interesting because it's a word that can create a misinterpretation, I guess, that is not what the teaching is talking about. So from the point of view of the teaching, we don't have to feel responsible to God. God is never going to judge us. This is a hypothetical God I'm putting in to make the point, because essentially God has become life, or there is no God and there is just life, and we're all functioning exactly according to our design. And so if there was a God, God would say, hey, well done, job well done. Because from God's perspective, life isn't meant to be the ideal version. Life is meant to be how life is in each moment. So it just doesn't make sense for a hypothetical God that understands the nature of life to say, hey, you didn't do a very good job. And you'd say, well, but that's how you made me this way. How can you tell me I didn't do a good job? And laugh. God will have a laugh and go, just kidding, just testing. You did exactly what you were meant to do. You did the only thing you could do. So no responsibility to God, which means you don't have to fear God. If you don't fear God, you can love God. That also means attitudinally, there's no need to feel shame for things that happened in the past, and no blame. And that is an attitude that needs to kick in after the fact. It's not meant to be an attitude that kicks in before the fact and acts as an excuse to do something, using non-doership as an excuse. Non-doership is really something to look at in hindsight, or to prevent us creating a projection into the future. It's not there as an excuse to just allow bad behavior to continue on. If it is being used as an excuse to carry on a certain type of action, that's not the understanding of non-doership, but that's rather the attachment to outcome, using the concept, thinking it excuses it. Now, the truth is that the understanding of non-doership doesn't prevent consequence from happening. It doesn't prevent us from being responsible to society. So when life happens. If life happens through this body, mind, organism, and pain is delivered to society, then society is going to judge me as if I'm the doer, and it's going to punish me or reward me, depending on whether I deliver pleasure or pain to society. So going up to the judge and saying, hey, I stole, but I'm not the doer, so I couldn't have helped it. The judge isn't going to suddenly say, oh, that's okay then, you're free to go. They say, I understand you're not the doer, I'm not the doer either, and the consequence to the action, not my doing, but a happening, is that you are going to be sentenced to 6 months in jail. So this understanding of non-doership isn't an excuse that helps you get away with things in life. What it does is it's an understanding that can prevent your attitude of guilt and blame and expectation into the future. And it doesn't even mean that feeling like it couldn't have happened different. When the understanding is there, that won't prevent us from feeling sad about something that happened. We understand it was a happening and it couldn't have happened differently. But the understanding is not being held as a belief that then prevents us from actually acknowledging the tragedy, if it's a tragedy of what has happened, or prevents us from acknowledging the non-optimality. So we see that our actions, which we were forced to do, ended up hurting a friend. And so I go, I understand that I couldn't have done it differently, so I won't feel shame, as in I should have done it differently. I'm not good enough for having done it the way that hurt someone I love. The shame won't be there. However, the appreciation that what happened through me did deliver pain to someone I love, wasn't my intention to deliver pain. It did deliver pain. And acknowledging that I'm sorry for what happened, it wasn't my intention, is something I can do in this moment to maybe lighten the burden of the pain that was delivered in the past. Or at least it's an attempt to add some pleasure or cut off the pain from being ongoing by saying, look, I'm really sorry, it wasn't my intention to do that. So the understanding of non-doership doesn't prevent us from, one, being responsible to society. Two, it doesn't prevent us, ideally, from being apologetic and recognizing when actions, even though they're not my doing, hurt the other. Three, the falling away of the belief in personal doership doesn't make life chaotic, doesn't make our actions chaotic, and it doesn't make us an irresponsible or untrustworthy person. What it does is it leaves our biological movements, our biological preferences in place, because what's fallen away is a psychological attitude, and our behaviors in the past have been coming from our biological design. So the belief in personal doership falling away doesn't change our preferences. So we're not going to suddenly pick up a gun and go and shoot people simply because we see that, oh, I'm not the doer. Because our tendency, our temperament is not designed to want to go around hurting people. If it was, we would have done that before, even when we believed we were the doer, and then we would have felt guilty about it. So the falling away of the attitude of doership means we won't feel guilty, but it doesn't mean we'll suddenly become an irresponsible member of society or pick up a gun and start shooting people. So the reason I don't say we're not responsible is because of all of those nuances. However, the attitude is, I am not the agent of what happens. I am the instrument through which life makes what is destined to happen. And so the agency is sort of prior to me, or at least not in my control. And at the same time, we learn from life, we learn from outcomes, and that learning is part of our updating, the new conditioning coming in that changes our up-to-date conditioning. And maybe we find that we act differently next time. which is also not my doing, but a result of life, bringing about new conditioning in the moment.
That's I think I'm starting to understand that distinction between the notion of non-doership and responsibility. I think I've often been confused by sort of competing responsibilities in my life, whether feeling responsible to myself, or again, depending on how you define the word self, but I guess it was probably my own pleasures or my own. And then responsibility to others, your family, your kids, whatever. Anyway, it's helped a great deal for me. Anyway, thank you for sort of outlining that distinction.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye.
Bye for now. Okay. We'll have one more question. Hi, Eric. Hello, Eric.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now I can.
Perfect. Nice talking to you. And
yes, thank you.
Nicer listening to you. And thank you for giving me that introduction before, because I felt that it might not be optimal for me to raise my hand today because I'm very out of balance. And have been for a couple of days, but it's not in a way that I feel worried about. But it's funny that you seem to say the right words at the right time for me, even if I listen to you on YouTube or now when I listen to you live. It's very strange. And because the last days here I've been laughing and crying a lot, and I thought that I didn't have a question, but actually when I think of it, I have some questions, and one question would be the question about feeling that I have no questions, and that being a problem, because when I feel that understanding goes deeper, I realize that, I didn't have a clue, but I thought I had a clue. But now I see. So that would be one thing. And the other thing would be about this weird past days, because I would describe it like it's baseballs just appearing in my torso and wanting to come out. Like, I don't know if you've seen the old Alien movies. It's a little like that. And sometimes it feels like they burst, and then it's either tears, crying, or it's laughter. And this can come also in between these weird sessions of torso explosions. Like during this talk earlier on, I was laughing for maybe 15 minutes straight. So that's when I took down my hand again, when I didn't stop. And it's I have no names for these feelings. It's just either sadness or happiness. It feels like, or just sadness or joy.
Well, I think in general, when these movements start happening, it's a very good sign. It's just, to me, in simple terms, it's a sign of a recalibration in the body, a rebalancing in the body, a changing of structures in the body. Primarily, it's a movement of beliefs. And belief, when if we could plug a scientific instrument on it, it's energy, it's frequency, it's density. And so as our beliefs change, a lot of energetic movements in the system, in the energetic part of the system, starts moving. Beliefs have a very powerful effect on the energetic system, and so the psychological identity tends to be dense, I guess you could say, on the energetic level, which has the effect of blocking the system and the energetic movement of the system. So once some bits get emptied out, there's space for the energy to move around, to rebalance, and then it rebalances in a way that the system is a bit less dense, and then another belief changes and another bit of energy gets released. Hopefully it's, releasing a bit more of the doership and attachment to identity, attachment to outcome identity. So if you find your body jerking and you find strange sensations happening, I think that's, in my experience, it's a very good sign. That, the emotions are very much part of that. The sudden shifts from feeling very contracted and like there's lots of despair to a complete change where there doesn't seem to be any problem at all, that the whole problem dissolves from one moment to the next, is that's why the laughing can come in often, or the laughing comes in when that shift happens. And this question of questions, it's there are certain hallmarks, I guess you could say, that come with suffering. So one of the hallmarks of suffering is that none of the concepts resonate, let's say. So if someone's in a lot of suffering, the concepts can be delivered and they can just hit the wall and slide off. Like they don't have any traction whatsoever. And so that's one of the hallmarks when there's strong suffering. When there's strong suffering, there can be the complete absence of any witnessing or any perspective. That's another hallmark that someone will experience when the suffering is strong. When the suffering is strong, we will feel like we need help from outside. We will feel like we are looking for answers. And we also have lots of questions. The more suffering there is, the less clarity there is, and therefore all of these questions come because we think we need answers to give us clarity. And then when the shift happens and the suffering is replaced by the absence of suffering, so when we go from flop to flip, then all the questions we had just seem to not make sense anymore, because the answers are self-evident in the clarity. The answers are self-evident. It's not even that the answers are self-evident so much, it's the question falls away. It sort of seems like, why would I have asked that question? And the answer is, we ask that question only when a certain perspective of life is in place. And when that falls away, the question falls away. And so it's very useful to keep in mind that understanding isn't really when we get all the questions answered. Or understanding isn't when we have all the answers to all the questions, but it's more when all the questions fall away. And that's synonymous with leaving the teachings behind as well. Along the way, a concept of non-doership or a concept of genes and up-to-date conditioning may be really important at breaking something down. And then when the suffering has fallen away and the identity is no longer there, then the concept of all of these concepts of genes and up-to-date conditioning and guilt and blame, they become irrelevant. They're really only relevant as part of the process of undoing the suffering. And at that point, you sort of think, what do I need to have all of this information for? It's like carrying tools around that you don't need anymore. You've built your house, so you can sell the tools that helped you build the house. You know, the analogy is you use the boat to get to the other side of the river, but then you don't carry the boat around on your back. So it's a good sign if the questions fall away.
Yeah, and I think it has much to do with how much the teaching covers, also how complete it is. It's by listening to many of your talks, because it's not that there is no suffering. There is definitely suffering, and there is like expectations, spiritual expectations is something I have been seeing a lot, and but the feeling has been that I have the toolkit. Like there is no questions about the toolkit, and that would be, of course, so much thanks to your teaching, Roger. So that is it's very 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 helpful.
This is nice to hear. I'm always very pleased to hear this feedback. I guess I wouldn't keep doing it if the feedback wasn't there.
Yeah.
So I understand, because it's, I understand firsthand. So this is nice to hear. There's a talk which I think is one of the better talks, because it focuses on a very important topic. So not necessarily better, but it's one that people should listen to. It's titled, "Is Your Expectation for Peace of Mind Getting in the Way of Peace of Mind?" Or something along those lines. So, part of the toolkit, because you mentioned that there is suffering and there's spiritual expectations, part of the toolkit is to see expectations as a form of suffering, which then cuts them off after a certain period of time of them being there. And, the spiritual expectations can be a form of expectation that sort of sneaks under the radar, because, we think, oh, well, if I've got an expectation for enlightenment, then that's okay. An expectation for all of the material things in life, well, that's attachment to outcome. But, an expectation for enlightenment, that's different. And there is a degree of difference to it. Having an attachment to liberation is a sort of higher order expectation. It's helpful in the process of seeking. But at some point it doesn't matter how higher order of attachment something is, at some point it becomes the obstacle that needs to be overcome. And so that's why in teachings it says, if you see Buddha on the road, kill him, which really means, in that case, Buddha is a representation of Buddha's teaching, the teaching that we might have become attached to. And so the representation of the teaching is the Buddha itself. It means you have to be willing to kill Buddha, which means the teachings have been so... It doesn't mean literally kill Buddha, but it means see that the teachings can get you so far, and then you have to go beyond the teachings. You have to go beyond, let go of Buddha as being what you need, realize that it's all beyond the teachings. Freedom lies beyond any of those concepts. And so, when we come into focus and we realize we might be attached to peace of mind, which is then making us resist suffering when it arises, because suffering is not peace of mind. So then if we're resisting suffering because we want peace of mind, we realize, let me drop this expectation of peace of mind. Let me drop this attachment to peace of mind, and then I can be at peace with my suffering. Whereas if I'm attached to peace of mind, I can't be at peace with the suffering, because it is getting in the way of my objective. And as soon as we become at peace with the suffering, ironically, we've taken this big leap towards peace of mind. So you might like to watch that particular video if you haven't already.
I will, for sure. And that trap, I am very glad to have that trap pointed out to me that you're describing now. It's a guaranteed recipe for suffering if you're stuck in that loop.
Yes. And lastly, the other expectation. So even if you have an expectation of peace of mind, and you know what peace of mind is, the end of suffering, that, as I said, that too can become an obstacle, but at least it's a obstacle. It includes in it what liberation is, peace of mind. It just means that if you have that attachment, then you're not going to have peace of mind, because peace of mind is the absence of attachment, even to peace of mind. But often we have attachment to, let's say, a oneness experience, or attachment to resting in being, or attachment to special powers, or attachment to becoming a perfect person, thinking that that is what enlightenment is. And that's a lower order of attachment, because it's attachment to enlightenment, but it's attachment to enlightenment that isn't available. So that's that's an expectation that has to be corrected, but corrected in a different way. The correction of that is for us to realize what real freedom is, and see that it's not a oneness experience, it's not bliss, it's not special powers, it's not being a perfect person, and then that expectation falls away. When that expectation falls away, then we might end up with the expectation of peace of mind as the absence of suffering. That's an improvement in a way, and obviously that has to be dropped as well. And that's why you often hear people saying, freedom is not the end of suffering, but freedom is not being involved in my suffering. And sometimes I don't know there's a benefit in someone even believing that liberation is not the end of suffering, but acceptance of suffering, which really means I understand it is a color of life, it's not my doing, and so if it's there, let it be there. And when someone lets go of thinking that liberation is the end of suffering, and replaces it with, no, it's not the end of suffering, it's the acceptance of suffering, what has happened really is the attachment to the end of suffering has been dissolved simply because someone has reclassified for them, not correct, has given them a new definition of enlightenment, which is, they say, enlightenment is not the end of suffering, but enlightenment is acceptance of suffering when it's there. So what that little trick has done is it has got someone to stop being attached to the end of suffering, and brought about a non-resistance to suffering, because the description will be, suffering is an inevitable part of life. It's always going to be there. It's never going to change. That's what some teachings will say, for the purpose of breaking our attachment to the end of suffering. Now, my definition is that liberation, enlightenment, is the end of suffering. When suffering is arising in the system, it means there's a part of the system that is confused. The identity, the false identity, is still there. So if there's an error in the system, if there's confusion, if the false identity is there, I don't think you can call that enlightenment or liberation. However, the non-involvement in that ongoing error, which is not anyone's doing, is much closer to liberation than involvement in the suffering when it's there. So hopefully you can see, and people can see, that the teachings are not giving you the truth. They're giving you concepts that are useful to undoing different blocks at different stages. And sometimes we relate to the concepts as truth. So someone who has heard that enlightenment is not the end of suffering, but it's acceptance of suffering, has found a freedom when their attachment to suffering and their resistance to suffering has fallen away. And then they believe that concept as truth because they found an extra degree of freedom, an extra degree of peace come in when there was an acceptance with their suffering. And they believe the statement as truth, and so it takes an explanation such as what I'm giving now to maybe penetrate that belief, where the person can then be at an appropriate point where there is witnessing of suffering, non-involvement in suffering, which is fantastic. That means the process is really moving ahead. And then the new concept can come in and says, and complete freedom. Don't get attached to complete freedom, because if you get attached to complete freedom, you'll go back to where you were. But inquire into what is at the base of that suffering. For as long as we are just interested in witnessing it because it's a color, we're not really interested at the root of it. And when we're not interested at the root of it, we don't look at it. And when we don't look at it, it's unlikely to change. So it's a fine line about being interested in it without being attached to it changing. As soon as we become attached to it changing, we resist it, and it becomes another layer of suffering on top of the suffering that we're looking at. So all of these little nuances just for the fun of it.
Is that okay? Sorry, Roger.
Oh no, you can. you can finish.
No, I don't want to keep you longer. If that was a good final, I think. No, but just very quickly, is that a little bit of a lagging? Is that an English word? In the system, when the suffering keeps arise but is witnessed, or is that a little bit of involvement in the beginning that triggers the suffering, but then remembering that you are the uninvolved witness, or do you understand?
If the suffering is arising in the first place, it means there's still remnants of doership in the system. And if when the suffering arises, it either gets witnessed or it gets cut off after a certain period of time. And they're two different things. Sometimes it doesn't get cut off, and the best we can have when it doesn't get cut off is a witnessing of the suffering. Then it just depends. That's just an indication of what's happening in the system at that point in time. The other option is that there isn't witnessing of the suffering, but involvement in the suffering. So there's four. There's involvement in the suffering. There's suffering arising and witnessing of it. There's suffering arising, witnessing, and cutting off of it. And the last is the suffering just doesn't arise to be witnessed or to be cut off or to be involved in. And those different movements are a reflection of the system at that particular point in time. And it can change around. It doesn't have to be linear from one to the other, but we tend to have a consistency or a predominance at different phases as the understanding goes deeper and deeper. So it tends to, in predominance, change from involvement in suffering, then it moves to witnessing of suffering, then it moves to witnessing of suffering with cutting off, getting shorter and shorter and shorter, and eventually the non-arising of suffering.